I'm Sarah Williamson, and this is Going Long with FCLT Global. On this show, you'll learn what it means to be long-term from the top minds in global business and investing. Leaders from companies and investment organizations join us to discuss how they are leading their teams for the long run on issues including capital allocation, risk management, climate change, and sustainability. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org. Our guest today is Nitin Nohria, who served as the 10th Dean of Harvard Business School just until the end of last year, from 2010 to 2020. And he was previously the chair of the Leadership Initiative, Senior Associate Dean of the Faculty Development, head of the Organizational Behavior Unit, and very importantly to us, has been a strategic advisor of FCLT Global since our founding. So Nitin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for having me on this podcast. I'm excited to do it.
So you're going into a interesting time where you have left behind the day-to-day of managing the school, and now can think more broadly, think about where business and the world are going. One of the things that I know from looking at the HBS materials, that what is one of your predecessors said that the school's mission was to educate leaders to make a decent profit decently. And when I attended HBS many years ago, we didn't hear as much about the decently part. We heard a lot about the profit part. We were very focused on shareholder value creation. So can you talk a little bit about how HBS has evolved its approach to value creation and thinking about long-term value over the 10 years that you were as dean there?
So it's just in terms of this particular articulation of our mission statement, that the role of the school was to educate leaders who could make a decent profit decently. Actually, that was an articulation of the mission of the school by the first dean of the school, Dean Gay. And it's worth just going back a little bit in terms of the context of when the school was founded. The school was founded in 1908. That's the time when business leaders were being called robber barons. It was the time when Upton Sinclair had published The Jungle to describe the terrifying conditions in meat packing factories and other kinds of business establishments. So the school was actually created with this idea that business had become so important to society. Alfred Chandler would later write that this was the moment when American enterprise went from something that a single proprietor could run to being organizations with tremendous scale and scope, railroads, steel companies, and that we needed a new managerial class to inhabit these firms that had the ethos of other professions. The law and medicine was in part in the back of his mind. So that, yes, the role of leaders was to make a profit, because in the end, that's the engine that powers a business enterprise, but to do so decently. And at that time, decently meant to act in ways that wasn't rapacious in the way in which the robber barons were being described as being rapacious, and to act in a way in which working conditions and others, which is what Upton Sinclair was describing in Jungle, would be improved as well. Here we are, almost 110 years after the founding of the school. And in many ways, I think that same call to action is being urged upon us by society today. If anything, we have seen through globalization that the power of the business corporation has become even greater in society. And our mission statement has, over time, evolved to say that we now want to educate leaders who make a difference in the world. But in some ways, the difference that we hope that we will make is this positive difference. So we could very well say that that original animation that we want to make sure that we have leaders who make a decent profit decently is very much at the heart of how one would think of a leader who makes a difference in the world. So we have, in the last 20 years, and certainly in my time as dean, tried to impress even more upon our students that business derives its license to operate from society. And if society doesn't view businesses as being in their interest, over time that license to operate will be curtailed in many, many ways. Certainly regulation is one way in which it can be curtailed. But it's important to look across the world. And one thing that globalization teaches us is that business doesn't have an open hand to operate in the same way every part of the world, and can very quickly be reined in. And in fact, there are some parts of the world that still operate under government control of business enterprises. And that is the last thing that we would wish for society to have. So I think it's that original mission statement of Harvard Business School is as important today as it ever was.
That's interesting. And I think it's interesting to think about the parallels from that time, 110 years ago to now. And as you said, there were very different forces at work at that time, and there are now, and even the threat in some countries of taking over businesses, which of course exists today, can really.
The parallels are quite remarkable, actually, right? So here we have the 1910s and the 1920s was a period of the rise of inequality in the United States. It was a period of tremendous environmental degradation. It was a time in which there was the antitrust movement. So there was very much even an opportunity in government to think about how do we rein in these companies that are becoming so powerful. And you can see various forms of, today people are talking about, has big tech become too large? And there's talk about, should we break up big tech? There's certainly, with climate change and what we just saw in Texas even this week, evidence that every day there's more and more evidence that, look, we better figure out the enormous impact business can cause on the environment and how do we rein that in. The inequalities of various kinds that COVID-19 has revealed. In some ways, it's shown a spotlight on inequalities that already existed, but now we have seen these in terms of health, in terms of so many other factors, right? Like clearly this affected some people disproportionately who were already on the marginal side of society. If you look at who's being hurt economically in terms of either unemployment or business closure, it tends to be people who are already marginal in their life. So many of the conditions that people were worried about in the 1910s when the school were founded are the things that we're now worrying about in 2020.
So the way we got out of those then and the way we get out of them now, I'm not sure those are good parallels, in that we had world wars and depression. So it would be much better.
Don't repeat. I hope this
get out of it, right? Yeah.
I think that there are, I take a lot of inspiration from the Japanese example in the 1980s. And maybe that is because that's when I came to the United States. I came to this country in 1984. And I remember talking to MBA students then and said, what did you learn from your time in the MBA program? And one student quipped, I learned that Japan is number one. And it was, it seems almost odd to remember that today because Japan has clearly gone sideways in the last 10, 15 years. But at that time, Japan was capturing the global imagination through the quality movement. And what the quality movement showed us was that it was possible to produce higher quality without having to increase the cost structure of the firm. In America, people had long believed that the only way you could produce greater quality was by increasing cost. And the Japanese demonstrated to us that, in fact, if you paid attention to quality, you could lower cost. It reduced waste just in time, but it required a disciplined management system to achieve these outcomes. It wasn't just good intentions that produced high quality. It was actually a whole innovation in a management system that was required to produce that. I think we're seeing similar examples now in the environmental movement, right? So you can see, for example, companies like Walmart that when they, a decade ago, got started on the journey of reducing the environmental footprint in their logistics chain, the estimate of the company was that it was increased costs by 1% in terms of cost of goods sold. But a decade later, they've actually found that it's reduced the cost of goods sold because it has allowed, if you're just disciplined about how you think about managing your logistics chain to reduce environmental costs, you can actually reduce the overall cost of the supply chain. So we're beginning, I don't think we have yet developed a comprehensive management system like the Toyota production system or lean manufacturing that we know can reliably reduce costs at the same time as improve quality. But we're getting there. So I feel optimistic that if we apply business imagination to these big social problems, I think reducing the environmental footprint is clearly the first one on which we're seeing progress, but maybe in the same way we'll see progress on living wages, we may see progress on health equity. But so my hope is that as management takes on what was previously viewed as problems that were in the social sphere, which only governments or NGOs could tackle, and now business is saying, what role might we have in tackling these questions? It will unleash a certain kind of business ingenuity of the kind that we saw during the quality movement. And we might be able to tackle these things in a way that over time actually reduces costs while still making enormous progress on these social issues. That's my hope, which is different than depressions and great wars and things like that.
That's a much better hope. So, there's sort of two things there that you're saying. One is to unleash the business problem solving mindset against big problems. And I think that is logical and hopefully is happening with people using the sort of business tools they've been taught, not just to run a business, but also to solve a social problem of some sort. The other is this idea of more stakeholder capitalism, if you will, which is actually running a business with the interests of a broader group of people in mind. Are you thinking about both of those things as similar?
I actually think that whether you call it stakeholder capitalism or what label you attach to it, I just think that business has almost no choice now but to pay attention to these major social issues, because we're seeing this, like employees will demand it of you, right? Just see, all of us know what happened this summer when we had the racial tensions boil over in the United States. It was incumbent on running Harvard Business School. There was no way that I could run Harvard Business School in a legitimate way without taking that issue on head on. And I think I'm not alone. Many business leaders realize that. We have seen universities shut down because of inadequate response to climate change. There are movements, some might call them radical, but nevertheless, there are movements for divestment and other things from universities, and just as we saw around apartheid. One might say that some of these things are misguided, but it doesn't matter what you say. I mean, the reality is that society is speaking loudly and it's asking all of us as organizations to tackle these issues. And I actually think that rather than view these as problems to avoid, if we internalize them and say that, what business is great at is to tackle, as you said, problems and to bring the full problem solving capacity of businesses to these problems. If we just bring that orientation, we can simultaneously, as I said, this doesn't have to be in any way inimical to the profit motive that drives companies. So we can go back all the way to the top, Sarah, where you began. We can make a decent profit and do it decently. And what decently now means is to start to tackle these big social issues that we as citizens should care about, because it's not that we're just business people, right? We're also citizens of this world, and the well-being of this world affects us personally, and it affects our enterprises. So I feel very optimistic, actually. I feel very optimistic. You've seen the Business Roundtable. You've seen so many businesses start to take the more progressive stance, which I'm advocating for. And I think that they will lead the way, just like Toyota led the way to show that the Toyota production system could. So all we need, one thing that is great about the business enterprise is that if one person shows the way of doing something that is both good and profitable, wonderfully business invites imitation, right? Like that's the nature of what Adam Smith talked about at the very beginning in The Wealth of Nations, right? That the reason why you could rely upon market forces is that if someone showed a better way, market forces through this invisible mechanism of imitation would lead others to imitate that approach too. So I'm hopeful that we will see examples in the next decade of companies that show us how to tackle these problems. And then we will be able to abstract from those lessons, and hopefully many others will learn how to do the same thing, and we'll make progress in a much more rapid way.
The case method in action, right? Seeing the examples and extrapolating from them. And one of the other things you've done, of course, over the years is served on boards. So sometimes we see, an inspirational leader or a charismatic leader really try to drive a business in a direction, but maybe run into some trouble in their boardroom in terms of, being a little more hidebound or something. Do you see boards pushing CEOs to be more progressive in terms of the way they're thinking about their business? Do you see them holding them back? Or, what advice do you give to the CEO who walks into their boardroom and feels either more short-term pressure from that board or just maybe more of a traditional mindset than what you're advocating?
So, one of the early opportunities I had to work with a CEO who had a very inspiring way of dealing with their board was Jim Rogers at a company called Synergy. Jim Rogers then went on to become CEO of Duke Power. And Jim was one of the early people who, even though he was running a utility, recognized that climate change was something that the energy industry needed to embrace and couldn't deny. So he did the work to educate the board from the outside to make sure that today those resources are a lot more plentiful for any CEO than it was when Jim Rogers was trying to do this for his board. As you know, we've seen this together, Sarah, just in the short time that FCLT has been in existence, that the amount of money that is now being deployed by investors who actually want companies to pay attention to these things is so large that I would imagine that one thing that a CEO could do if they face a skeptical board is to bring in one of their investors who actually cares about the company doing these things, to talk to the board, to help the board recognize that this is what investors will demand with increasing strident nature with time. So you might as well get going on this journey today, because it's not a journey that you're going to get from here to there in a short period of time. And it's going to take a long, sustained effort for companies to make progress on any of these issues. And you can wait till people demand change in a very aggressive manner, or you can get going on it today. So I would hope that CEOs who face skepticism from their board would rally some external people to the cause and expose their board members to the real pressures that they're going to face from shareholders. And not just other constituencies, but you can also bring in, as I learned from Doug McMillan, that David Bass at Walmart had brought in the EDF to talk to the board. So, which is, it's hard to imagine, that's like saying, okay, do we really want to let the people who people would be most wanting to put at bay into the boardroom? But that conversation proved very important to Walmart in its journey to try and embrace this objective of decreasing the environmental footprint of their supply chain and their logistics infrastructure. So I think that there are many ways in which CEOs today can gain support for moving this agenda forward. The most important thing I still feel is for the CEO themselves to first internalize and be willing to lead this effort.
It's interesting that you're obviously, we're living in a time of polarization of politics, and sort of what you're saying here is make sure your board hears some different views, maybe from some views from people that they wouldn't normally talk to, or they wouldn't normally run into. And I think that's a very good lesson for all of us in many ways, which is try to understand where the other side is coming from.
Yeah, and I I think that, just to be clear, I'm a deep believer in capitalism. I actually think that this is what I'm arguing for is completely compatible with being a capitalist. In fact, I think that unless the profit motive is applied to these problems, the rate and pace at which they will get solved will be much too slow for society. I think the single best way to get these problems addressed is to, again, apply business imagination to say, how can we tackle these things in a way that over time increases the profit of the company? It may not do it immediately, which is why you do have to have a long-term view. But the nice thing about markets is that while markets may be out of whack with the company in the short run, if you produce great economic returns over the long run, markets do recognize that. So all you have to bet on is your own problem-solving capability, which, by the way, is what business people have to bet on every day in any case. So it's not that you're betting on anything different when you take on challenges like this.
You're just applying those same problem-solving capabilities to something that's perhaps slightly different, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's slightly different, and it may take slightly longer. It may require you to exercise imagination in slightly different ways. So it's in some ways, it's like R&D. It's a little bit like every company thinks of itself as doing R&D, but it thinks of itself as doing R&D around new products. This is R&D around new management approaches to tackle a different class of problems. But it is that same gear that I think companies deep inside know how to exercise.
So I know that you're setting up, or the business school is setting up an endowment for business and society in your honor. Is this the kind of question that you think that will be exploring? Because obviously Harvard Business School is the mecca of capitalism in some ways, and as you said, it can be used to really address some of these.
I have issues. Always felt that the role of business is to create a more prosperous and healthy society. And, people say, well, as law schools are to creating a more just society and medical schools are to creating a more healthy, to ensure the health of individuals and our society. What is the role of business? I think the role of business is to create prosperity and to create shared prosperity, because if prosperity is only enjoyed by a few, that's not a prosperous society, right? Like when I came from India to the United States as an immigrant, what was remarkable about this country is that the average person in the United States had a standard of living that the average person in India did not have. And that's what people looked up to. And how did that get produced? It got produced because America was a society that embraced capitalism. When I was growing up, India was still very much a socialist country. And so it is possible for capitalism to create prosperity for society. And that should be its aspiration. And today what we're seeing is that it's creating this prosperity very unequally. And so we should aim to create increasing prosperity for those who are already prosperous, but we should certainly aim to lift those who feel less prosperous and are feeling left behind. I absolutely think that is doable. I don't think that is in any way incompatible with capitalism. In fact, I think it is essential to capitalism that we continue to believe that this is the mechanism by which we can create the greatest amount of prosperity for the greatest number of people in the world.
So we talked a minute ago about the time over 100 years ago of around the founding of the school, but you've also mentioned Adam Smith. So if we think about the teachings of Adam Smith, and I know you have studied him a lot and are joining this prize panel to give an academic prize at Panmure House, which is where he lived and died, for the funding of innovation. If we think about Adam Smith's teaching 250 years ago and his idea of the single proprietorship and the invisible hand, the wealth of nations, and also the moral sentiments, do you think there's good lessons for us to revisit and learn today, or is that mindset just baked into sort of our view of capitalism that you've been talking about? Do we need to go back and study Adam Smith
I
some more?
sometimes think that we may have forgotten some of the kind of, sometimes going back to the original text. It's a little bit like what I love about America is that everybody goes back to the Constitution. And while there's a lot of debate about what the Constitution really meant, and there's people who are originalists and there's people who are contextualists, that ability to permanently have this conversation about what would our founding fathers have wanted us to do or think about is just such an inspiring idea. And in many ways, I think that Adam Smith plays that equivalent role in business, right? Like that's in some ways some of the original ideas that we have built business on, and it's useful occasionally to interrogate business again and ask the question, what would Adam Smith have asked us to do today? And I think that my view, in some ways, he would remind us that the role of business is to make a decent profit decently. Because everybody reads, of course, The Wealth of Nations, in which Adam Smith reminds us about how powerful the profit motive is as a way to get the invisible hand of business to work, so that automatically prices would settle at an equilibrium level, because if I overcharged you for something, then someone else would charge you the right price. And if you would, as a customer, go to them and no coordination would be required between you and I, the market would itself make sure that the right transactions would occur in society, because in the end, the most efficient producer of a good would be the one that the most number of customers would be excited about, right? So I think today, Adam Smith would say to us that that is still the most powerful way to create prosperity in the world, that markets are amazingly powerful forces. He was not naive to say that markets are always efficient. He would remind us that, yes, there are times when markets are inefficient and you need to worry about inefficient markets. But what Adam Smith also wrote is this great other book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is much less read and much less talked about. And that's when he talked about the second part of the original mission statement of our business school, right, which is to make a decent profit decently. And he did say that, look, society is governed by moral sentiments as well. Even though it is possible for someone to sell umbrellas on a wet day at 10 times the price, society would abhor that. And he reminded people that they need to act decently. They shouldn't be usurious. You shouldn't take advantage of people. Long-term trust is an important asset for business people to have. And if you have long-term trust where you forbear today, it will come back to you in some ways tomorrow. So the theory of moral sentiments is full of why behaving decently in the end is not incompatible with making a profit decently. So I hope that that's what business leaders today, if they were to confront Adam Smith again, would recognize that what society is saying is, look, we're not unhappy with businesses making a profit, but too many people in society are now not enjoying the benefits of business. And we would hope that business would address these concerns. And so if you do that, so if you act decently, if you act like a decent person and start to tackle these problems, I think in the end, society will recognize and reward business by giving it an even greater license to operate. And today that license is being questioned, and we in business need to regain that license to operate by re-internalizing what Adam Smith taught us.
We'll go back to the beginning. That's and I think that the theory of moral sentiments, as you said, is not quoted as much, but if you have the two together, it really does. It gets to both parts of this. And I think it's very interesting these days that business does have quite a bit of trust, according to Edelman Trust Barometer and all of those sorts of measures, or at least my employer has that level of trust relative to, for example, the government or the media or other sorts of institutions. So which may be quite different than in the 1908, 1910. So there really
That's why to me it's so important right now that business take this moment, because the reality is that most people look at governments and they say that while governments may have good intentions, and I really do think that governments have good intentions, they may neither have the financial nor the administrative capacity sometimes to tackle these big issues, right? Because so much of what government does these days, the resources of governments are tied up in what I think of as long-term liabilities, right? Securing pensions, securing long-term health. So governments don't have that much capacity to tackle these more urgent, important issues today. NGOs, in any case, live on the fact that private citizens either give them resources or in some ways they can form partnerships with governments. So they're very effective entities as well. But I think business now needs to be in the middle of the fray. And that doesn't mean it has to act in a way that is hostile to government or hostile to, this is not a competition, like we need to work together. So this idea of public-private partnerships, whether it's public-private partnerships with NGOs, public-private partnerships with government, there's some way in which we need to harness our collective collaborative power to tackle these big problems. And in fact, in most cases, when you see real progress being made against these good problems, again, I'll use the Walmart example, which is a kind of great example. It actually, Walmart decided to partner with EDF to think about getting ideas on how to tackle its environmental footprint. In many cases, it needed to also work with local governments to figure out how to address these issues as well. So when you take on big social issues, you can't act in a way in which there's hostility amongst these parties because the aims are the same. Now, collaborating between these parties is complicated. It's not easy, but that's the new management gear that we need to learn.
Yes, that is, and that's a very different management gear than simply running a model or cost, or it's an ability to get people with different interests or different backgrounds to work together towards a common goal, and that's what obviously that's what a great leader can do.
And in some ways, leaders have learned how to do that within their companies, right? It's not like within companies, if you run a multi-divisional company, or even if you run a company with any company, people always talk about interfunctional conflict, interdivisional conflict, different interests within the same companies. So we as people who teach management and study leadership are inherently always teach people that resolving conflict, finding common goals, creating shared incentives, finding the common purpose around which people might align themselves. This is a task that we do internal to companies all the time. I think the task is made more complicated when you introduce the interests of other stakeholders like employees, unions, communities. But at its core, it's still about trying to find that problem-solving approach to say, okay, we may have these different interests, but on this one we're aligned, and let's figure out a way to at least work on this one. So we don't have to be aligned on everything, but can we find those places where we are, in fact, have sufficient alignment of interest to move forward and to tackle these problems in a pragmatic and sensible way? I think that there are many, many such solutions to be found. And the proof of that is that there are businesses who are able to do it. So to me, that, maybe this is the inherent commitment to case method teaching, which is if you can find a single example where this is possible, then at some level it proves that it is possible. It's just a matter of everyone, all the rest of us having an equivalent imagination of asking, yes, my situation may be different from that particular case, but what can I do in my situation to produce a similar outcome?
Yes, that sort of coordination and collaboration is the difference between a sole proprietorship and managing a large company. And so perhaps that coordination stops at your walls, but oftentimes it doesn't, because people work with their whole supply chains. So I think that having that breadth is important, but also having a little bit of that time is important as well. Because as you said, if it's just transactional, do we make a deal right this minute and then we're done? That's a very different mindset than if you've got a long-term relationship, and you can see that in terms of the relationship between management and a workforce, or something, as if they have.
Or how, in some ways, going back to my Japanese example, one of the things that I remember witnessing when I studied manufacturing in the United States in the early 90s is how many companies learned that they needed to change their relationship with suppliers from being a pure transactional relationship in which they beat them up every year on price, to recognize that actually if you created a real partnership and you brought the supplier in early when you were engaging in product design itself, you might get win-win solutions in which you could in fact get the same price decreases that you were looking for, but you got them not by just beating people up in an adversarial relationship every day, but by in fact creating a partnership with your suppliers from the start. So we have seen many examples in which people reframe their relationship. And I really think of suppliers as being one example of how that relationship got reframed. That doesn't mean that they're still not competing interests. And, of course, you want to make sure that every day you have a conversation with your suppliers about how can we lower prices. But you can do it in a way that is still makes a long-term partnership happen. The same thing is true of suppliers, right? Like you could, with customers, like businesses have learned that about lifetime value of customers, right? Like you can, if you think about the lifetime value of a customer, you might do things today in the customer's interest that may not get you the full surplus that you could extract today, but you'll get more of that surplus over time. So there are many, many examples in which we have learned about how a longer term orientation in which you build trust between parties over time can actually produce economic benefit to both parties over time. And I think that mindset is a mindset that we now need to bring to a whole new range of problems and constituencies.
And I think that win-win mindset is what businesses tend to be good at, because obviously you don't enter a new market or build your company unless you produce something that somebody wants, that they're going to be better off by using. And so I think that win-win mindset is a critical part of the business world that hopefully can push this.
Yeah, so I used to, students had often asked me in our new mission statement, which says to educate leaders who make a difference in the world. And people often say, what do you mean by a difference? Shouldn't you say positive difference? And I say, if the day we have to say that you make a positive difference and that's not implied by that statement, that's a day that we're in real trouble, because I hope it is understood that you have to make a positive difference in the world. And my definition of a positive difference is very simple, which is if you create more value than you claim for yourself, you're making a positive difference. And by the way, every transaction depends upon that, right? Like the customer has to feel that they got something that was slightly more valuable to them than the price that they paid for it. Any customer who feels that is a loyal customer. An employee who feels that for the effort that they put in, that the company treated them well, that this is a company that treats them better than their alternative, that's the company that has the most loyal employees, right? So if you end up in every exchange relationship just asking that question, did I create more value in that exchange relationship than I kept for myself? Now you have to keep enough for yourself to continue to be in business, right? Which is why you have to make a decent profit. It's not like you can afford to do it in a way in which you're not being mindful that in the end, if the value that you keep for yourself doesn't end up being sufficient for you to do business, then you won't be able to, in fact, provide that exchange the next day to the person. So that's not a good trade. But there should always be a trade in which the other person feels that you created more value for them than you kept for yourself. And if you just keep that in mind, and I think that was what Adam Smith, just going back to the fundamentals, I think that's what if you read The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments together, in one sitting, if you could read both, I think you would come up with that conclusion. So what I love about the core of business is that it's actually so simple. Mm-hmm. Right? You have to find ways of creating value for society. And if you find ways of creating value for society in a sustainable manner, society will always reward you by allowing you to make a decent profit. Because that's what society wants for itself. It wants what businesses can deliver in a long-term sustainable way that creates value for society.
Well, that's a very, that may be a great way to wrap this up, which is that, as we think about what we're trying to do at FCLT Global, it's to rebalance capital markets to support that long-term sustainable economy. And as you think about businesses and the ones that are thriving over long periods of time and creating that sustainable business model, it is that, going back to Adam Smith, a combination of the two, as you said. And I like the way you put that, just, having a little bit more value, that leaving a little bit more value for that customer. So one last question for you is, HBS talks a lot about lifelong learning, and learning throughout, not just going to school and then going on, but learning throughout your life. So now that you've stepped down as dean and had maybe a little bit more white space in your calendar, what do you want to learn next? What's the next thing you're going to try to learn?
Maybe it's because of COVID, but I have gotten absolutely fascinated by what I think of as likely to be a golden age in the life sciences. I really think that the opportunity that we have in the life sciences to think about human health, human longevity, human flourishing is extraordinary. And I want to learn a little bit more of the science. So I'm actually trying to dedicate myself to learning a little bit more of the science. So my new project is I've gone back to I was a chemical engineer a long time ago, and I must confess that I know nothing about chemical engineering now, but I'm going back to learn a little bit about molecular biology and all of the things that we're learning about how, just these new COVID vaccines only happen because we have started to understand the mysteries of biology a little bit more rationally. And I want to see if I can learn some of that. So that's my project for this year.
Well, that sounds like a very valuable project and something that will pay off over the long term. So Nitin, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your leadership of the business school, and we appreciate your guidance over this time at FCLT Global. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I really hope that the mission of FCLT, which is to really promote this long-term orientation, is one that we all embrace. Because in the end, I think it's good for business and it's good for society.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Going Long with FCLT Global. Be sure to hit subscribe to get new episodes every other Monday. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org.